Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session, Sustained Innovation Through Practice Diffusion, with our special guest, Dr. Schau, Professor of Marketing and Executive Director of the McGuire Center for Entrepreneurship at Eller College of Management, University of Arizona. My name is Alexander. I'm a part of a higher education team here at IVExec, and I will be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions, which you can do using the question box in your Zoom control panel. Please make sure to use this feature for all the questions you may have for the presenter, while we invite you to use the in-chat feature for sharing any thoughts you may have with the rest of the audience. We'll be having a formal Q&A session, so please feel free to send in your questions throughout the session. Additionally, we're recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our presenter, Dr. Schau. Schau joined the Eller College of Management in 2005. She earned her PhD in comparative culture and MBA with an emphasis in marketing from the University of California, Irvine. She led the Filing Research Institute Center of Excellence for Consumer Decision-Making in the financial services sector from 2016 to 2020. Prior to joining the Eller faculty, she was an assistant professor of marketing at the Fox School of Business at Temple University. Her research focuses on innovation, market-oriented technological meditation, practice diffusion and adoption, collaborative value creation, consumption journeys, and brand building. Her research has appeared in premier venues such as the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, Journal of Retailing, Journal of Advertising, Journal of Business Research, Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, Rural Sociology, and Agriculture and Human Values. She is an associate editor at the Journal of Consumer Research and an area editor of the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science and the Journal of Business Research. She serves on the editorial review board for several journals, including Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, Journal of Business Research, and Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. Welcome, Dr. Schau.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me. I am very excited to be here, and apparently I think I need to engage you to come and, talk about me before I enter rooms from now on, because I was just like, wow, okay, who knew? So I'm really excited. I'm going to share some research today that come from 3 different projects, and we're going to try to wrap it around the idea of sustained innovation. And so let's begin. So our goals today are to think about innovation. So what makes an innovation? Why is it innovative? What does it disrupt? What does it add to our value streams? To think about practices or the ways in which people use these innovations, and to think about how practices diffuse through different environments. Ultimately, we're going to get to the place where we think about sustained innovation. So I have some pictures on here just to think about. There was an innovation, arguably an innovation, when they launched the ThighMaster in the 1980s. And that was purchased a lot and not well used. People didn't tend to bring that into their workout regimes. We think about Ring, which is a technology that allows us to see what is going on at our front door or around our property via an app, which is a security measure, but not necessarily a security system in the same way. We have our phones, which we call our phones, but they actually are devices which we use to do our work, to communicate with others, to shop, all kinds of things. In fact, very few people use it to speak on the phone as a predominant use. And then we think about Zoom. So Zoom is a technology that existed before the pandemic and became very popular during the pandemic, and I would argue is a sustained innovation. So when we think of the technologies that I have here, I would argue that the ThighMaster is not necessarily a sustained innovation, that the Ring may indeed be a sustained innovation. Definitely the mobile phone and Zoom are sustained innovations. And we'll kind of think through what I mean by that and how it works. So when we think about an innovation, we think about a new idea, a method, or a device, something that changes our value flow throughout a market system, in our case, And when we think about that, it's things that maybe allow us to do things differently than we did before, hopefully better and more efficiently. Sometimes that's not the case, but that's the idea, that something will come into our market space that will enhance our value. So I'm going to think about these we kind of went over what innovations could be, but we are going to focus today on these three. One is a streaming. So the way we used to watch TV is now very different, and it is very different in a lot of different ways. So it is different in the content that we watch. It is different in the manner in which we watch it. It is different on the screens with which we watch it. And the ways we engage with the narratives are different. When we think about smart mirrors, that's a technology that was introduced during pandemic. It gained some more acceptance, but hasn't really fostered the same value that we imagined that it would. But there are some uses for which have been sustained. So we'll kind of talk through that. And then thinking about Instagram or a way to document experiences. So when we go back to kind of our classic theory and probably the most well-known theory about diffusion, it goes back to 1962 and Rogers. And he has this idea, which is very easy to understand. It's also fairly accurate when we think about the way people buy things. And that's that we have some innovators who adopt and purchase items that come into market quickly. And then we have kind of the early adopters, that next set, that get excited about a technology after a few people have used it and talked it up, and they begin to use it. And then we get this majority of users, and those majorities can be super evangelical and excited and talk about the technologies, and then that middle can last quite a long time. But eventually there will be kind of the laggards, the people that were last to market, if you will. And this is a very apt description of the ways in which people buy things, but it doesn't account for the ways that innovations are used and sustained in markets. So what I mean by that is if we think about a particular sport, and I will kind of betray some of my interests here, and that's that I like surfing. So if we think about surfing, and it used to be a Polynesian practice, specifically it was cultural in orientation. We had a lot of the reigning class, kind of the royalty that were doing surfing. There were people who were surfing and establishing food systems that way. So fishing with spears and surfing in that way, surfing for pleasure, all kinds of things happening in that Polynesian cultural practice. But that may not account for how we got to be an Olympic sport. How did this Polynesian practice, arguably Polynesian practice, kind of diffuse to the space where many, many people are doing it and it becomes an Olympic sport? So that is actually the context in which we study things, but I'm going to argue that the context is just that, the context. Instead, I want us to think about our 2022 paper with my colleagues, Melissa and Steve, that practice diffusion is not about the way surfing spreads. That was the context in which we looked at it. But today, we're going to think about practices, how people watch TV, how people shop for clothing, and how people document experience. So when we think about research, we often put it in the context in which it was examined. And I want us to already kind of break that open and think about research comes out of very different contexts and is being able to transport our understanding to different phenomena. So when we look at this phone, we still call it a phone. And yet, as I told you earlier, people rarely are using it to speak on the phone. They do speak on the phone, but they do many other things with it. It might wake them up. It might allow them to watch narratives. It might give them their email. It might keep them up on news. All of these are available to us on this device that we call a phone. So if we think about that, and we think about the way people watch TV, and I say TV in quotes, and buy clothes and document experiences, then when you get to a picture like this, these people are waiting for probably a commute that they're on. They're waiting to take public transportation, and they're all looking at their phones. And there isn't any real clear way to understand what they're doing on that phone just by looking at it. Now, we could measure how many people bought a phone. We could do that, but we wouldn't get to the level of understanding how they do things on their phone and how that phone changed the ways in which they do other things or perform practices. These people could be watching TV, shopping, or documenting experiences. And so let's kind of back up a little bit and think, well, what do we mean by uses as practices? Practices are composed of three primary elements: materials, the things or technologies that are embedded in the practice; the competences, how do we use those things; and the meanings, the motivations or the understandings we have, kind of maybe the why we do things, would be embedded in the meaning. And what we know from prior research is that these are interdependent three elements, and that their bonds between them are very important. So the way material has meaning, and the meaning we attach to competence, and the competence we have for the materials are all very important. So not just the three elements, but the connections between the three. And that kind of sounds really complicated when we think about it, but hopefully through the course of our conversation today, we can think about the ways in which we can use this every day. So let me go back and look at the practice of watching TV. And I have a recent paper with some great colleagues in the Journal of Consumer Research that looks at this. And if we think about it, we talk about television narratives as narratives. And we think about transmedia space, a word that sounds really frightening, but is actually just all of the content around the content of the narrative that we watch. So if you're watching television on Netflix, you're streaming your content, you might be able to dig deeper on when it was produced, who the actors are. You might go to your phone and look up, oh, I think I've seen this actor before. What have they been in? All of that space we call transmedia. So it's kind of a complicated word for something that we do all the time. We are constantly thinking about who these actors are, where we've seen them before, perhaps how old they are, where they may have intersected with some kind of news that we might have remembered them being connected to. So all of these ways, we think of those as transmedia. And when we create narratives, when people create narratives, they have to think about all of that transmedia and all of the meanings and associations that are attached to the content that they're delivering, the materials which they use, and also thinking about the actors that they engage to be in those narratives. They all bring to them some potential brand enhancement, but also possibly some complexities. If we look at these pictures from the leftmost, and we see that that's probably the way television is thought of in those early days. The family gathered around the television, they watched particular programs together. They had to decide on that content. There wasn't a lot to decide on, but there was some content that they had to decide, are we watching it, are we not watching it? And we generally were watching it in a unit, a collective. We think then about the show Friends and the way we watch TV like that. Friends is actually being streamed on almost every particular platform you can imagine. It's considered what we call a comfort narrative. So if you think about comfort foods, things that you eat when you're uncomfortable and you want to feel better, and they generally have a lot of carbs and maybe not the most nutrient dense food. And that's kind of the way we think about these narratives that are comfort narratives. You watch Friends when you want to relax, you want to laugh, you want to not be stressed about the day that you might have had, you might turn on Friends. And then we also think about the watching TV as all the different screens in which we watch it. And sometimes we watch it on multiple screens at the same time. And we watch it sometimes individually. So all of these are the ways in which we watch TV that are problematized in our research. So how did they watch it? What devices did they use? What meanings did they attach? Those are the conversations that we had. This particular research, we used some surveys. We mined forums online. We collected interview data. So we interviewed some of our informants. We had them create diaries of their television viewing experiences. And then we also have a set that videotaped weeks on end of their television consumption that we analyzed. So it's a rather robust data set to imagine how people are using these devices and how they are streaming media. So I want to think about this and maybe ask you some questions. I think we'll collect some of your answers and think about how that moves through our conversation. But do you watch content on different screens? Do you binge watch? Do you watch one episode after another? And do you ever skip any scenes? Those are some questions to think about. And when we get to the end of thinking about TV, maybe we can review some of the answers that you have. So again, the materials have somewhat changed in that there is a television set from the early years. We might have then transitioned to a flat screen. We may have then decided we were going to watch it on an iPod or a smaller iPad and a smaller screen, or we might even imagine that we can watch it right on our phone. And we see a lot of people watching complex narratives on small screens, and that's something we need to imagine is different today than it was in earlier times. We also can think that the materials, the actual content that we're consuming has changed. In this space, these three are contemporary, meaning they still exist in our streaming space, but they offer very different understandings and different kinds of narratives. So if we look at Law and Order, it's been around more than 25 years. The content is called a legal procedural, a police or legal procedural. It has a very formulaic format of the way in which the plot unfolds. There is, I would like to say, justice in about an hour. So something happens, we follow that case through to its completion, and there is some sort of judgment, some kind of justice that occurs, usually at the end of that. And it's very cyclical. The next time we reset and watch a different crime as it unfolds. Then we have promotional material or other stream content that looks like House of Cards. So House of Cards is actually a remake of a British television show. And it came out on Netflix, and it did a few things very differently in that narrative space. It's a very high-powered cast, some of which have complexities, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And even more importantly, they did different ways in which they actually dropped the whole series. So instead of having series drop or become accessible to people on weekly installments, we were watching them drop the entire season on a Friday and people watching the entire season on a Saturday and Sunday. So it is a very different cadence and a different way of examining contexts or narrative properties, as we call them. So it's a very different way of watching. And then when we look at Money Heist, that is not an English-speaking narrative. It actually came from Spain. It's in Spanish. It was not terribly popular when it was in Spain. It was, I mean, marginally popular, but then Netflix picked it up, changed its name to an accessible name. As they said, I think the original name was also accessible, but what they imagined would be easier for people to understand what the narrative is about. It's about a heist, a bank heist, and there have been several seasons of this. So what they might have imagined would be finished in one season and then move on to creating a different narrative became so popular that there are multiple seasons of the show with different heists going on. So we see these kind of different narratives, the very, very practical, we understand who's going to be, who's the criminal, who's the perpetrator, but also who's also in law enforcement and how this is going to play out. And we get a resolution in less than an hour versus some of these others that create a narrative that goes over time. And these are very different. So if we think about that, there's also a lot of competencies that are important. And so we have to figure out how to watch TV again, or how to watch streamed content. We imagine that if we binge watch one after another, eventually they will ask us if we're still watching. And some of us can probably remember that experience of having someone ask you, are you still watching? Yes, I'm still watching. I want to find out the end of the English breaking show, whatever that is you get excited about. But you have to learn that you have to click the button to continue watching. There's many different remotes that work. There's many, many different formats in which we watch it. And all of these have to be learned. So there used to be kind of a joke that when VCRs first came into being, that they told time, but many people didn't know how to program the time. So it would say 12, 12, 12, 12, showing that we weren't very competent in our usage of that device. Now the devices have moved into such sophistication that even pretty technical people may not be incredibly well versed in how all of these different devices work. And then the meanings have changed. The meanings have changed in that sometimes we're now watching TV and it's just to relax, and there's no real narrative content. It's just a series of pictures. Again, we might be looking at a narrative that is telling us a story, but then we're looking at it on our phone as well so that we can dig deeper about particular actors, a prior episode's synopsis, all kinds of different ways in which we're using multiple screens, and we are attending to the meanings of these devices, but also the meanings that are embedded in the content very differently. we might see things that come up in those kind of spaces that spark whole new conversations. So we have this Stark in the streets and wildling in the sheets kind of meme that took off coming from the Game of Thrones. It is kind of a reference to the types of characters that are in the narrative and positioning oneself into that narrative in that way. We might, as I said, be watching Friends when we're upset. Maybe we didn't do as well on some task that we imagined we were going to nail, and we want to feel comfortable, and we go and visit our ready friends on Friends, and we feel better. We also have this idea that those narratives that we watch become part of us. So those of us who say watched Game of Thrones or who have seen Friends are different from people who maybe didn't see those things. And so the meanings then attach to identities themselves. We also see the performance of watching TV very differently. There was this notion that we kind of sat there and we were enraptured with the content coming from the screen, and we watched that exclusively. That was our attention. But now we're seeing that we are kind of watching TV in very different ways. So Peloton uses the screen to give you experience, sometimes on demand, sometimes live, of being embedded in a class, a group fitness class, and having a coach. And in that place, you're not just sitting and watching it, you are participating in that. And that changes our way of performing the practice, and it has meanings and competences that are associated with it. So here's some other pieces from our data. We have Penny, and Penny's interesting because she likes to know the end. We have this belief that we like to be transported into narratives and that we like to watch them unfold as the producers created them. But this is often not the case. And for Penny, it is not. She says, I like to know the end. I like to know the story. She goes to great lengths. She knows that the show that she watches airs in Korea on a Monday. And so she watches it on a Tuesday. And she waits for that delay so that they release the episode synopsis. And also she gets the transmedia of everybody commenting on this before she sees it. And that's really important to her. So she's seeking, if you will, spoilers. We have Where It's At, who is an online poster, and he talks about a binger, which used to have a very different meaning, but here it means watching multiple episodes at a time. And he FFs, which is fast forward, he, she, they, FF, which is a fast forward, and they look through the recaps. What's interesting is the way in which they now understand recaps. The recap lets you know what past events the episode that you're going to watch is going to draw on. So despite the fact that Where It's At has seen the last 5 episodes, they attend to the recap to understand which parts of prior episodes are going to be relevant to the content that they're going to see. And while in the television business, production houses created these recaps for that purpose, very few people understood that that was the purpose. Most people thought it was just kind of a general, like, here's where the narrative was before, not that those particular elements of the recap were going to come into play with, the current narrative. Then we also have Julio, and Julio says it's a game when the season drops. So here he was talking about House of Cards. It drops and then they power through the episodes and they watch it on fast forward. And they say, yeah, it distorts the voices a bit and the scenes are a little cartoon-like, but you can get through the whole episode in 30 minutes. So they are able to get the gist of the story, even though it's cartoon-like and the voices are strange, and just binge much faster through the narrative than they could before. But importantly, Julio watches it with the remote in his hand so that he can stop it when he wants to attend to more detail on a particular piece of the content. So a very different way of watching TV. In fact, I don't expect you to be like, what are all of these things? I just want to give you a flavor for the center part, the primary text, and being transported into that text is the reigning theory for how people attend to streamed content or watch TV. But we found out that that's actually not the way most people are watching TV, that they are thinking about content, whether they condense it or augment it. So whether they take pieces of it out, or whether they augment it by learning more about the transmedia, and then whether they decelerate it, whether they watch it very slowly or rewatch it versus whether they accelerate or fast forward. And it gives a myriad of ways in which people can watch TV. I will give you a little example of the condensing. So some people who are watching the Game of Thrones were not terribly excited about Daenerys. I don't know why, but they, for whatever reason, they thought Daenerys was far away and unlikely to make it to the central site of the narrative. And so they kind of wrote Daenerys out, actually cutting out the sections, fast forwarding through the sections. That proved to be at their peril. I don't want to give you any spoiler alerts, but it probably would be important to know about that character in the way that the narrative actually cashed out in the end. So that may have been to their peril, but many, many people did it. Or maybe they went through other characters that they didn't prefer. And so we're thinking that all of these other ways, and we use kind of an eating metaphor, are actually the way in which people are watching these streamed contents. So you might think, well, what does that have to do with managerial practice? And so let me give you some ideas. We would want to create content with extreme consistency. So back in the day, you might film a movie and somebody's hair may be slightly different from one scene to another and nobody mentions it, or their outfit might be subtly different. In these cases where people are watching them on small screens, close to their face, rewinding, watching it again, there has to be extreme consistency. We also know that people are watching it across multiple screens. So we want to make the central content able to be read on a very small screen, just in case that's where they're watching it. We also want to be able to allow them to choose the narrative direction. So in the case of Black Mirror Bandersnatch, you could actually go through this narrative content any way you wanted. There were decision points you could choose, and the narrative unfolded from your choice. We also learned that product placement has to be prominent and plot embedded, that if it's kind of ambient in a scene, people probably will not attend to it, especially people who are fast forwarding or condensing in other ways. And if you put it in, it's prominently displayed and it's embedded in the plot, you're going to get a lot more traction for those placements. And then also thinking about those people who come to a narrative, like say Lost, many years after production, we want to make sure that we think about how we market to them. So we have been marketing narratives pretty much only when it was active and at the cadence of when it first drops on its initial airing, its premiere. But people are coming to these narratives on streaming platforms years after they've been created. So how do we promote these narratives so that they live on, and yet we don't give spoilers for people who don't want spoilers? We have to meet the audience where it is, and then also provide transmedia content because people want to know that. So people watching the relaunch or reboot of Dynasty want to know where they can find those clothes, what kind of shoes they're wearing. They did the same kind of thing on Sex and the City. And there was website content where you could purchase those particular items or items that look like that in a fast fashion sense if you couldn't afford the brand names. So let's look and see, did we have some kind of conversation about what they were doing? Were they watching television and binging on different screens? Do we have? No?
So we did, in fact, received one question in the meantime.
Oh, okay.
It says, to what end does the brand story or brand narrative structure have an impact on consumers' experience?
So we've seen that play out in many ways. Narratives that have closure in discrete periods of time, so episodics, are easy to be engaged in very casually. Ones that are more complicated and that evolve over a season tend to demand a lot more attention. So being cognizant of the ways in which people watch it, they watch at a show versus they watch every single show, is very important. So it changes the way they produce the content. And it also will change the way that they market this content later on, and its ability to be aired again in what we used to call reruns or to be streamed. It doesn't do a lot of good if it's a narrative property that develops over episode and season after season. If you're missing an episode or missing a whole season, that's not ideal. So we're finding ways in which they can create contracts so that it can be streamed later, and ways in which it makes sense to rerun the material. So hopefully that was great. So let me see.
And we have one more.
Okay.
Do you believe a show should choose to release in chunks or in episodes, since there are pros and cons and different streaming services have had different approaches?
Yes, that is true. So we find that with contests, so like the Great British Baking Show, Having them kind of the cadence of dropping one every week prolongs people's excitement about this and gives them more opportunity to look at the transmedia and get more engaged with the contestants. So we see like America's Next Top Model and whatnot doing that kind of week by week. When they go into streaming and they are able to stream the whole thing, we will get another lift in looking at transmedia or engaging with the brand, but it tends to be more fleeting. So the dropping all of it or watching it all tends to have a shorter engagement lifespan overall, but the mixture of both tends to be that kind of sweet spot. If it kind of comes out every week and then people can also stream it as a whole unit, that tends to be the strongest brand stories. There's also some few things that happen with watching TV that are what we call narrative exposure externalities. And that's that people, as we talked about with friends, create these parasocial relationships. And they also have kind of unrealistic understandings of what actually is happening in the world today. So for an example, you might be engaged in a long-term relationship, and we are told that the initial romance and the initial solidification of that relationship is what's most important, and everything else is, and then they lived happily ever after. And when we think about that, that means that the rest of their lives together are somehow less important than their initial meeting, which is very strange because most of their social life will be led, if it's a long-term relationship, in this partnership. So that's kind of an interesting balance that changes the way we think about things. It also, when we think about CSI, it taught us a lot about science and justice. It taught us that we could get DNA to rule in or rule out suspects, and that it would happen in a rather timely fashion. And again, there's the sense that we will get justice in a discrete period of time. But people who have been engaged in these kind of unfortunate events know that they unfold over years and years. And so the expectation that we will, have a DNA sample and it will be back in a week, and then we will solve this case is not actually how it works in real life. And we've seen some very troubling things having to do with like rape kits that are collected and then never tested because of resources and many other things. But we have this belief that it will be. And that causes a discrepancy between what we see in real life and what we see on TV, and it causes some problems. We also see success as being very socio-material. So people who are have a lot of money are seen as successful in a lot of the narratives that we watch, as opposed to people who do great things. We sometimes see that, but we overwhelmingly see that success has to do with monetary financial strength. And that's also kind of something that we need to think about. There's a lot of ways to be successful, and that's only one of them. But it causes lots of pressure on people, whether they're successful and measuring themselves. So now let's kind of switch gears and think about clothes shopping. And if you look at this, we have a new paper with some colleagues on how we embed artificial intelligence into retail spaces. And so if you think of this kind of 50s way of shopping, which is still something we can do today. We can go into a store in person. We can be helped by a salesperson, and they can kind of curate the offerings towards the questions that we answer or the tastes that we display. Or we can think about what's happening in the digital space, where we're buying all kinds of brands on different platforms. We're buying them on the branded platforms, we're buying them on aggregator platforms, and then we're also buying them used in some spaces. On like eBay, you see a lot of clothes being sold that maybe were gently used or hopefully gently used. And this means that our shopping has changed. So there could be, if we think about the materials, there could be the kind of dressing rooms, there could be then the smart mirrors, and then there could be the smart mirrors with inventory control in it, which is a very specialized part of the smart mirror. And when we think about that, let's again discuss that perhaps during the pandemic, it was more difficult for people to go to stores and shop in more traditional ways. And so we saw the rise of some of these technologies, but they didn't end up being sustained. So if we think about that, I would like to argue that when you're in the shop itself, there's no real trade-off. You would rather put the clothes on and see how you move in them and how it feels than use the smart mirror. The smart mirror at that site might not be the best place to embed it. The smart mirror that tells you this particular size and color that you want is not here, but it is down the street and you can go pick it up, or it's actually located in a different region and then you can send it to your house. That does kind of make sense in a space, because we used to have to rely on sales staff to call around to find the items that we want. So in that sense, we can say that's probably predicted to work pretty well. The competences that we have are very different. We have to understand how to purchase clothes, how to take our picture in it so that we can share it with other people, maybe to even vote on whether we purchase this or not, or whether we wear it on a specific occasion or not. And although it's tempting to imagine that this happens only among, say, teenagers or young adults, we see that especially family who are going to a reunion of some sort, a wedding, these kinds of events that they are not co-located, are using a lot of these technologies to sync up their outfits or their costuming for these events. And so they need to know how to do these in different ways. And so we're seeing the fact that you might purchase something by going to the shop with your friends, and then you might look online for something to be paired with it. And that becomes a very different thing. How do I know that this feels and fits like this? And then I have to decide whether the digital replication of it is going to fit with it without seeing it. So we have to learn like little tricks of the trade on how we use these and merge these technologies. And then also the meaning of clothes has changed. And again, hating to go back to this pandemic, but I think it would be fair to say that many of us worked in these virtual environments where we were very conscious of our clothing choices from the waist up, and probably less cognizant of our clothing choices from the waist down. So some people may have had looked like they were wearing a suit, and on the bottom they may have been wearing shorts. People who would ordinarily wear work shoes or shoes that would go with the outfit they're wearing, maybe barefoot or wearing flip-flops or some other thing, because it wasn't exposed on the video camera. So we have this notion that dressing up is for an occasion, and that we can kind of get around that by knowing what the occasion is. We also know that we see back in the 50s, those kind of narratives where people were walking around the house dressed, perhaps in those kind of suits that we see there, or in whatever gender presentation they're looking for, if it's the dress with pearls, and they're just walking around their house that way. And then we see it in narratives like the reboot of Dynasty, and it's almost laughable. The idea that they would be wearing a ball gown in their living room is somewhat ridiculous, because we have these different meanings of clothes. And that leads me to the kind of athletic clothes, which are great because they're comfortable. And we know that lots of people buy yoga clothes that do not actually perform yoga in them. They may go to the store, they may go to a lot of places, but they're not actually meaning to do yoga. So these are kind of changing things. When we look at the practices and we know that texture and fit are important, then we have to figure out technologies that will approximate that. So not just kind of how would this look on me, but how do I feel when I move it? We need to move into those kind of technologies. We need to create consistent sizing schemes so that when we're buying across these formats, we have some likelihood that it will fit. We need to think about suggesting whole outfits and not just items, because people are curating these things. Some of you may have seen the classic film Clueless, where her closet was able to curate items that she could wear before she went to her high school, which the technology did not actually exist at the time, but actually does exist now. We need to meet that audience where they are, and we need to provide all kinds of content around if they're very interested in not having leather, that this is a vegan or a safe place, and then to think about social if that's something they think about. So I'm going to change gears now and sort of think, so we went through how do we watch TV, how do we buy clothes, and now I want us to think a little bit about how we document experiences. And I have a recent paper that came out in Journal of Advertising that talks about that's so Instagrammable, and it refers to these kinds of environments and consumers taking pictures and posting it on social as indirect advertising. So it's not direct in that the company didn't pay you to produce it, but they sure did encourage you to do so. And so if we think about the old days where we might have sent a postcard, hey, I'm in California, and then people go, oh, California, I look at those pictures and I want to go, versus these kind of more immersive pictures that people are creating today of their experiences. And that leads me to kind of my second set of questions. But you don't have to answer them if you don't want to, but think about them. And that's like, do you take more pictures now that you can have a camera on your phone and that we have ways in which we can post them? And although some of you are going to say, no, I don't, I just want to remind you that back in the early days of photography, you might be photographed once in your lifetime. And now people are photographing themselves, multiple times a day. So probably you are photographing yourself a little bit more. And then also thinking about how, have you ever felt that taking this picture was dominating your experience instead of enjoying the experience itself? And I think if you were honest with yourself, perhaps that would also be something that's coming up. And then thinking about how you share the pictures on social. So we want to get the right angle, we want to get the right frame of it. And we are manipulating our experience so that it's photographable. And that kind of leads us to these new ideas of materials, the selfie stick, the Instagram wall, which is a very popular one, and just Instagram in general. We use Instagram in the title of our paper, but it could be any of the formats. We just used the one that was most visual for our research. And you have to learn how to do all of these things, right? You have to learn how to use the selfie stick. You got to learn how and when to post. There are all kinds of tricks of the trade, making sure that you look attractive, the place looks attractive, making sure that, if you're going to Palm Springs, you hit those Instagrammable spots, because when you tell your friends you went to Palm Springs, they're going to expect that you went to some of these iconic spaces that they have seen on Instagram and promoted in this way. So it kind of changes the way we think about the practice of going on vacation or enjoying oneself. And it has very managerial implications. And I just want to highlight a few. If you're really worried about documenting experiences, you're probably going to hire architects to create some of your retail scapes, to create the restaurants so that they have the ability to look like you're alone, even when you're in a crowd. You'll want to bring kind of a sense of the best lighting for a picture if taken in the most popular ways. And you might want to point people toward those. So thinking about how do you create the spaces that inspire this kind of capture? And then how do we build experiences around the capture? So there are whole museums that we call Instagram museums, the Museum of Ice Cream, the Museum of Color, and they're located in lots of urban areas. And people go there to take all of their selfies and post them online. I want to show you an extreme example. This is an art installation in rural Texas, and it's actually a Prada shop. And the inside does contain a curated set of Prada items. And you cannot go in there, it's not functioning. You cannot go in there and you cannot purchase things, but you can take your picture with this. And that was a very popular art installation. People were going to this location to take their picture with Prada. Ironically, they were leaving urban areas where there were Prada stores that they could have done this in. And it's very interesting. Or if you think of like the Rainforest Cafe, or any of these places that made these great experiences that then altered them slightly so that they could also be captured. And so people are kind of sacrificing the actual experience for the capture or for the picture, and they're creating all these modes of indirect advertising. So I think probably you can relate to some of those things. And now I want to switch gears if this is true. So research that we did on practices and research that we did on practice diffusion, which is related to this slide, was actually created thinking about how a cultural practice became a sport in the Olympics, but actually has a lot of relevance to how we think about pandemic healthcare practices. So we had to learn how to wear a mask. A lot of us had never really worn a mask before. We had to learn how to wear this mask. This is what the mask should look like. It shouldn't be cloth. It should look like this. I learned the hard way that it should have sort of a firm exterior so that when I breathe in, it doesn't come into my mouth. We had to learn why we were doing this. We were safeguarding other people from droplets. So we were preventing infection. And then we had to learn how to socially distance ourselves while wearing a mask, while speaking loud enough that people could understand us. And all of this with our hand washing and our all these germ protocols, some of which washing hands, we kind of knew, but we had to put them together with different things. And so the research that I had said, we would not want to say, so many people have masks, that's not enough. We have to actually say, we're going to promote what the meanings are of this, and we're going to show you how to competently use these things. And I can tell you, when I went to the grocery store for the first time during pandemic when we were allowed to go to the grocery store. So there was the lockdown and then that ability. I thought of the grocery store as a very different place. I never knew that I could only go one way down the aisle and that I needed to heed these, in-floor spaces. I didn't know. So I had to learn, and I'm sure many of you did. And we can talk about how it's not just enough to distribute the masks, but we have to think about what the materials are, what are their meanings, and how do we competently use them in order to prevent disease. And then if we go back and revisit kind of the failure in a way of smart mirrors that aren't attached to inventory, smart mirrors that are attached to inventory have been well adopted in retail spaces, but the regular smart mirror technology has not. And when we think about that, we can find places where, say, the feel of something and the way we move in it isn't as important. And it became very popular with like glasses apps. So buying glasses at a distance, people were really able to put that smart mirror to use. And we understood that we were previewing goods, and we understood that we could upload a picture of ourselves and get kind of a virtual understanding of how the frames would look. And so these was much better translation of the technology into the practice. How do people actually try on glasses? Weirdly, people tend to put glasses on their face and look at themselves. They don't move with them and see how they move as much. So this technology really worked well. Also, hashtag, maybe we do want to move more when we try on our glasses so that we know whether or not they work in the manner in which we imagined them to. So kind of going to open up for questions, and I just want to revisit the things that we thought about today based on several research projects, all gathered around the ways in which innovations, changes in the ways in which we have materials and practices. We were able to look at how, say, smart mirrors work or don't work. We were able to look at the ways in which people watch television and differences that makes for advertisers and producers of the content. We were able to think through how being able to document our experience and post it creates a different, say, vacation experience or a different experience in general than it might have been had that not been the goal. So I think we've looked at how innovations are introduced into value flows or markets, and how practices are probably more predictive of sustained innovation than just purchase. And then thinking about how the diffusion of a particular practice is really what's critical to that sustained innovation. And again, when we think about diffusion, it's how many people are now streaming. Or if we look at these examples that we started with, when we think about the Thigh Master is a product that has a very specific, working out your thighs. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't readily attach to other workout regimes even. It's probably predicted in our research not to be well sustained. If we think about Ring, it's replacing some technologies where people were surveilling their home for security purposes, but then became something very different that was sustained. And that's like, we could see that our Amazon package arrived. Or in my case, I have a naughty dog that sometimes escapes my house. And sometimes I'm in the middle of doing something like this, or conducting a class or speaking with my co-authors. And I see, oh, somebody's at the door. Oh, wait a second, they have my dog. So I better go and attend to that. So I think what used to be for just security is now for a lot of other measures. And then thinking about how we use that phone for many different things. And that's why it's become a sustained innovation, because whenever we want to do something else with it, we just create a new app that can do that. And then if we think about Zoom, which actually mostly supplanted our use of a technology called Skype. And the reason that happened, if we were to have a conversation about that, is that Zoom enabled many people. Specifically, you could go upward of 100 people to convene together in this space. And they were ready for that during the pandemic. And so a lot of business applications, educational applications went there because Skype was very difficult for more than 3 people to use at a time. So Zoom was able to be used handily during this crisis and is now used all the time because people aren't going to probably be traveling as much for work. We still should travel and be in person for some activities, but there are many activities that we can do on Zoom, and we do on Zoom. We're also finding that people who are out sick, and I put it in quotes because I mean that maybe they really should be laying down, or maybe they are sick in ways that they can continue to work, whichever that is. They're able to continue to do that on Zoom. And so many of us have been like, I'm too sick to come in. I don't want to give you my infection, but now I'm going to jump on a Zoom and we can have this particular meeting. And so the content and the work can continue on. And that creates the sustained innovation, that there are different ways to use it. We know how to do it, and we're able to adjust our meanings. So I just want to say thank you. And we have some time for questions. And I would really like to hear some of the things that you're thinking about the research that I've been doing. So thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Schau, for this very, very informative and interesting presentation. I must say, I found myself guilty of a couple of things, especially the binge watch and skipping scenes. But yeah, I do agree, Zoom became a verb, and it's hard to imagine the time before COVID now with all the online meetings and everything. We did in fact receive a couple of questions. So let me start with the first question. Says, what are key factors influencing diffusion dynamics of sustainable product and service innovations?
So ways in which we can, if we were to predict which kinds of technologies will be adopted, they are generally ones that can be brought into a practice somebody already knows. So that's why watching television, people readily adopted video technology in the early days, and then they went to the streaming services rather handily because it's a practice they were doing anyway, and they were able to implement a new technology. There was a motivation to learn something that wasn't too complicated, and then to sustain the use through added benefits. So in the streaming context, the added benefit are so many more narratives and the control that I can watch what I want to watch when I want to watch it, instead of turning on the TV and being like, okay, well, they're playing Judge Judy, and so that's what I have to watch. You can decide what you're going to watch. So I would say those factors are: is it a practice that they already know? The disruption is the technology, not the practice. That's going to probably be much more beneficial for sustainment. If we can also attach to multiple uses, so like the thigh master is only one use, generally speaking, those are less likely, and unless it's so specialized and so desired that no other technology can do it, then we might see a sustained innovation be a unitask. But we have to attach to different kinds of meanings. And so I would say that sustained practice diffusion occurs when the meanings are aligned with the competences. So we want to do something, we have motivations to do it, we have the skills that we can apply to them. And then we also recognize many different values for doing that. And then I think those are the most predictive. The most predictive.
Okay, thank you. And a separate question, which sounds like a follow-up, says, what are the consequences of practice diffusion on practice reproduction?
That is a very good question. So practice diffusion implies a replication. It can't be diffused unless you have ongoing practice. So I would say that there's a little, I don't want to say endogeneity. There's a little bit of a confound in that we can consider a practice active if it is being reenacted. So when you study a practice, its kind of ongoing nature is important. But can you ask the question one more time? Because I want to make sure I hit that third part of it.
Sure. So the question says, what are the consequences of practice diffusion on practice reproduction?
Okay, so when the practice is diffused and are used in cases like, let's use the mask scenario. We understand when we're going to use it. It's very likely that while the messages about the meanings and availability of the materials are present, we will continue to replicate the practice. What becomes tricky is when we need to nuance the use of a particular item, or we have to modify the practice in ways that that are evolving. And I think the mask mandate was one of those things. You cannot enter buildings. Oh, now you can enter buildings, but if you don't feel comfortable going without a mask, you should wear a mask. And so we had all these changes in what is the competent or adroit performance of the mask. I think in those cases, the reproduction of the practice is in jeopardy, because people look around and they're now looking, are you wearing a mask? And should I be wearing a mask? It's not clear anymore. So when the linkages between the meanings, the competences, and the meanings, the competences, and the materials have been broken, they become less likely to be reproduced. And then the practice diffusion will probably end. Or if not end, it has to be reinvigorated in order to continue. And I think the mask mandate kind of gives us an example of that. When to wear a mask, how to wear the mask. Some people were wearing the mask on their chin, and that wasn't really appropriate. And so we had to constantly re-message why, how, and hand out the materials, give access to the materials. And so sustained would mean you have access to all these, you know how to use them, and you know why you're doing it. And so we have seen that, like with streaming, it just took off because people, that resonated with them very clearly.
Thank you. Okay, the next question says, which factors, actors, and institutional settings are characteristic of different groups of diffusion processes?
Okay. So again, if we use we can use something like a streaming service, but let's use the mask mandate again, because we had lots of institutions telling us about this. We had the CDC telling us about this. We had, news media telling us about this. We had local enactments telling us about this. So I think a practice can diffuse when any institution or market actor presents itself with, here are the materials, these are the meanings. And if we allow for that, it will expand. But I think that importantly, some institutions hold more sway, like if it's legalized versus not legalized. So we see this with cannabis. It used to be a material that was illegal, now it's legal. And so that we have to relearn how we think about that product category. I think it depends also on your connection to it. If here at the University of Arizona, whenever a mandate or a suggestion came out about practice change, moving our classes to Zoom, wearing masks, holding office hours, because I feel very attached to the University of Arizona, I was very eager to comply and to diffuse that practice among my network, tell people about what, perhaps was an appropriate performance of that. So I think it depends. Any institution and any actor can start a practice, but it probably will not be heeded or taken forward unless they have some kind of formal authority or they have a strong identification with the people who are hearing that practice effort.
Perfect, thank you. And we do have time for one more question. It says, to what extent do diffusion processes of sustainable product and service innovations differ from each other? And can different groups of diffusion processes be identified?
Yes. So yes, we could do that. We in the paper that we have with colleagues looking at the retail adoption, we found that when the local store employees were championing this practice and they were messaging them the why, the how, the when, these things would just kind of take off. We would see a lot of uptick when local people were enacting them. When people are talking about the practice and they're not performing the practice, we see that those seem to be inauthentic and people don't attend to that message and they don't heed those messages. So I would say that when we think about it, people who want the practice to diffuse, people who perform the practice are already more credible and people are more likely to attend to those messages and to perform it in the way in which they were taught. People who are giving this message and it seems gratuitous, like we would like you to take your picture in front of this particular space and post it. If it's too heavy-handed, then we find that people will not actually take their pictures in those spaces and kind of produce that indirect advertising. So there's a lot of complex things like authenticity that are operating. There's whether or not you're included in the conversations about meaning or what materials are being used, that can also affect whether. So a co-evolution space, much more likely. Somebody with a lot of authority, much more likely to create a diffusion. Something that's very close to what you're already doing, it just requires a small tweak, more likely to move through. So there's different mechanisms.
Perfect. Well, again, thanks so much, Dr. Schau, for having time to guide us through all the things we have actually took for granted during this COVID era. Thank you so much for the informative presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to present for the IVExec audience. And I would like also to thank everyone for joining us today. As previously mentioned, we have recorded this session, so you can look forward to receiving your recording in the coming days. And I wish you all great rest of the day. Enjoy.
Thank you.